Peter Linebaugh is the fifth and the last speaker of Spaces in Common, our seminar series. And we've been looking forward to his talk since he kindly accepted our invitation. To introduce him, I would say Peter Linebaugh is a child of empire as he describes himself in his bio. Schooled in many places including London, rural New York State, Washington DC, Bonn and Karachi. Again, in his own words, he was educated at the Quaker Swarthmore College during the Civil Rights days, by the Cold Warriors of Columbia University, and by the Radicals and Peaceniks at the University of Warwick. He has taught at Harvard University and Attica Penitentiary, at New York University and the Federal Penitentiary in Marion, Illinois, and finally retired from the University of Toledo. In 1975, with a group of scholars including E.P. Thompson, he co-authored Albion's Fatal Tree. In 1991, he published London Hanged. A decade later, with Marcus Rediker, he co-authored The Many-Headed Hydra. His more recent books are the Magna Carta Manifesto, published in 2008, and Stop Thief, published in 2014, and the one that was recently out with the title of The Incomplete, True, Authentic, and Wonderful History of May Day. You might, some of you might be familiar with his writings from Midnight Notes Collective, Counterpunch, and Zero Word Peak Edits. Okay, I'm leaving the floor to Peter Linebaugh. Thank you.
Thanks, Güldem. Thank you very much. I would like to thank Güldem and Derya for inviting me to their seminar, Spaces in Common. I would also like to thank my Turkish translator and publisher from Autonom Collective. Where are they?
They are also working.
Yeah, this place has an association with tobacco. Is tobacco an old plant in Turkey? Many. Is it an indigenous plant? Do we know?
This place is called DEPO.
Okay.
That's why it's a depot for
Tobacco.
Tobacco, originally.
Yes. Yeah. Today, I am, besides gratitude to the people I mentioned, I am confused, and I have several sources of confusion. The first one is that for years I have been working on the subject of two people, Ned and Kate. Colonel Edward Marcus Despard and Catherine. I have been studying them for a long time. And you have a title of my remarks, which is I'm going to assert that the origin of the USA and the origin of the UK and the origin of the Industrial Revolution lay in the destruction of the commons. That is my thesis. And therefore, to get right to the conclusion, save ourselves time, the reclamation of the commons requires the destruction of the USA, the UK, and the Industrial Revolution. So, what do you think of that? All right. notes, I began to write for you. And then the other source of my confusion is, I will be clear. May I read aloud for a few minutes?
Okay.
Coming on a jet-propelled airplane from Michigan to Istanbul, the imagination adopts what used to be called a bird's eye view. Though this viewpoint is obtained only by the expenditure of a considerable volume of fossil fuel. And actually, we obtain this view also from satellites, which give us images on our GPS. But these also depend on a gigantic expenditure of rocket fuel to put the satellites into orbit. So this view reveals a similar pattern in the relationship of land to water from where I come from to where I am. Despite the difference that Michigan is in the middle of a continent, while Istanbul is in between two continents. I live among Great Lakes. The fact that they're the largest volume, the largest volume of fresh water on planet Earth. Two of those lakes, Lake Huron and Lake Erie, are joined not by a single strait, but by two which connect with a smaller lake called Lake St. Clair. Remember that. The pattern is similar, though on a smaller scale, to that of the Black Sea, the Aegean Sea, and the Sea of Marmara, which are also joined by a pair of straits at the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles. Or the Hellespont, where civilization began as I was taught as an Anglo child. But since being here, I am learning. My mind has been colonized by my experience, but I hope I can learn. This similarity provides a creative environment for trade and transport. The commodity form and its abstraction money originated perhaps in this zone. This is what I was taught. From here, commerce in food, or wheat and other grains, and fuel, like oil, military and culture could open into the Mediterranean, to North Africa, the Middle East, and thus into the globe. As for the region I come from, the hydrographic pattern, though it's similar, it's on a smaller scale, geographically, but this has not halted its dominance, because Detroit was the destination of iron ore and coal found elsewhere in the Great Lakes, as well as an intermediary point in the export of grains from the plains of North America into the seaways leading to the Atlantic and thus to the globe. So I'm comparing the origin of the commodity form in this region to the automobile civilization of the region that I'm from, both of which I think have a relationship to these characteristics on planet Earth. Now, the automobile civilization that had its center in Detroit has long passed. We do not speak of horse civilization or Ferdinand Brodel's mule civilization, or llama civilization, other forms of transport, but we do speak of automobile civilization because it requires a massive public infrastructure of roads, bridges, tunnels to transform city and country. And the automobile requires the production of many components of iron and steel, rubber and coal, whose origin is dispersed and whose extraction is privatized. And it all requires two other commodities that are fundamental to our life today. Number one is gasoline, and number two is labor power. Now, the commodity of labor power is disappearing as an effective force in Michigan. And what had been the center of the largest freshwater in the world has left many Michiganders thirsty because water has been denied to them, or it has been poisoned in Detroit and in Flint. Flint is important to us in North America because that's the origin of the great sit-down strikes when labor power organized as a working class. Now, that same city, that same labor power is being poisoned through its water in the midst of the largest freshwater in the world. Meanwhile, on this side of it, I have everything to learn about the wars, about how new labor power is being created by wars in Syria and other parts of this region. And I have everything to learn that the refugee is a product of borders, passports, and states, as well as a product of climate change, as the aridity line in North Africa and the Middle East and Pakistan and Afghanistan, the aridity line defined as 200 milliliters of water a year required to produce cereal crops, to produce food. As desertification increases, that zone enlarges on the planet. That zone is the direct result, we think, of automobile civilization, but what I am proposing and what I have been learning through my studies of Ned and Kate, that this civilization, the gases that have caused this, originated in the so-called Industrial Revolution. Now, North America consists of Mexico, Canada, and a country which has no name of its own, that is the USA. Now, each has contributed significantly to the international discussion that brings us together, the discussion of the commons. In Mexico, this discussion began in 1994, perhaps, with the appearance of the Zapatista Liberation Army and the reclamation of expropriated lands, of the ejido, or the common lands of each village, formally guaranteed in the Mexican Constitution of 1912 to 1920. That is a common land to every village. Those have been destroyed by the USA in 1994 in the North American Free Trade Treaty. As a result of that, and at the same time, the Zapatista began an effort to reclaim common lands, and to do so in the name not of abstract labor power, and to do so in the name not of the working class of the automobiles, but in the name of the brown people, the people who are the color of the earth, the indigenous people of Mexico, who have long been disenfranchised from civil society and the state. So, with the effort to reclaim the commons in Mexico is also a parallel effort for justice for the indigenous people. Okay, Mexico. Where am I? Canada. In Canada, Oh, coming here, you know that statistic I gave you about the aridity line? I learned that from a great Canadian journalist, Naomi Klein, who is very significant to us in the Americas because she has united the struggles in Argentina with those that are in Chicago and in other parts of North America. And I'm sure she is known to some of you as well as a pioneer, a journalist. I hope she's on the radio soon, if she hasn't been already. And she is a wonderful speaker, and she is the one who taught me about the aridity line. And what she learned from this aridity line, what she discovered, is as that line has moved, you know, across North Africa and through the Middle East to produce fresh labor power, or refugees, you know, disenfranchised refugees, so that line is a place where the drones have fallen, where terror from the sky comes down. So war and climate change, Naomi Klein was showing at the Edward Said lecture 2 months ago in London, are parallel, inviting us to think about how is the peace movement related to the movement of climate change and the restoration of the commons. So the Canadian contribution in our part of the world to the discussion of the commons is largely through its indigenous peoples, who are opposing the effort to destroy the climate, their ecology, the forests, the lakes. Maybe you read about the great, in the name of fracking. Fracking, which is already causing multiple 500 earthquakes alone last year in Oklahoma, in the middle of the USA, where there had been no earthquakes before. The tremendous fires in Alberta that last month, burning a city down, directly caused by fracking, or the search for natural gas to propel this so-called civilization. Now in the USA, a contribution to the commons has been small and indirect. When I say small, I refer to the occupying of the center of cities, beginning with the Occupy Wall Street, but going through at least 500 other cities, and which were closed down or cleared with the knowledge of President Obama at the end of 2011, beginning of 2012. There, a generation of people in cities all over the United States began to sleep, began to meet for the first time the problems of sleep, the problems of safety for women, the problems of access to water, the problems of food, the problems of health, and to, amongst themselves, find solutions to these human needs in common, in a society that has spent years to develop competitive, individualistic, racial, gender divisions. So though this movement was small, it was seriously threatening to the founding values of the USA, which is why the police had to clear it so rapidly. But the USA is a slave society. Never forget it. It's a slave society. And that means, to this day, that the plantation, known as the prison, incarcerates more people than proportionately to any other society in the world. The police state is the defense of capitalism in the USA. It's the defense of the imperial aggression of the USA, is that police state. That police state, I will teach you the origin of it. I can do that. Excuse me, I'm breathing heavy and I'm ready to boom like this because
in my mind is not you, wonderful listeners, but in my mind are the academic warriors who make a division between the plantation and the factory, who make a division between the working class and the slavery, who make a division between police and crime. Among you, I know you will be skeptical, but you're willing to give it a fair hearing, and you can understand basic structural features of the USA economy, because those structural features have, as with empire, spread around the world. Yes, it has. So the movement called Black Lives Matter, its significance is that it begins to challenge the police state. Do you follow me? So these are the two contributions. And here's my sentence. Logically, historically, culturally, ethically, architecturally, politically, and legally, the prison and the commons stand in direct opposition, in massive antagonism, absolute antipathy, complete contradiction to one another. And again, that is a proposition that could be theoretical, right? That counts as theory? Well, whether it does or doesn't, Mr. Hart and Mr. Nabry, it is the historical fact. The prison and the commons are historically opposed to one another. And in fact, the prison was introduced as a complement to the destruction of the commons in the years that Ned and Kate were in love. In the years that those two comrades around the planet fought to preserve the commons. Not time to turn the page. So there's the beginning. I try to compare where I come from in Michigan to this region. But this isn't the first time that conflicts, is it okay to refer to this area as Asia Minor? Or is that not? Is that? What?
All of them wrong in a way.
They're all wrong in a way.
Middle East, Europe, Asia.
They're all wrong. Okay, but I'm a historian, so I have to live with this backward language. But as I said, I'm willing to learn. And perhaps you can help me reformulate this. On May Day, 1802, we historians, we love dates, and this is my favorite date. An Irishman named John Güldem spoke at the Royal Irish Academy off of Grafton Street in Dublin. A few years earlier, after the defeat of the Irish Rebellion of 1798, when 30,000 Irishmen were destroyed by Lord Cornwallis and the British Empire, 30,000. That's the same number as were killed in the Paris Commune. John Donne left and went to America. And he went to Michigan. And he lived with the Miami indigenous people, whose leader was named Little Turtle. And Little Turtle gave him a new name. a Miami name. And John Donne, with this new identity, became friends with Little Turtle. We must remember Little Turtle and study him because he led the first defeat of the USA. It gives me joy. That was in 1791. That defeat is called the Battle of 1,000 Slain, or the Battle of Sinclair's Defeat in 1791. Good. This is an important date too. See, some people are taking notes. This is good. Yes. Sorry, man. That's what I am. I'm a professor and a scholar, and it takes work to get these things in your head, and to keep them there requires writing. Where was I? St. Clair's Defeat. Well, remember the big Lake Huron, the little Lake Erie are joined by Lake St. Clair. It's named after this guy who was defeated, and 1,000 settlers were defeated, and they lay in the battlefield. And when it came time to collect them, they discovered in their mouth was earth, because the Miami Indians said their hunger for land is so great that let them eat. That's the first defeat of the USA. Now when I say the USA, I'm using a technical name. That actual name comes from Thomas Paine, Tom Paine. And it's a technical name because in 1787, the U.S. Constitution was formed, establishing the USA. The goal was to unite, as Max Weber might say, money and guns in a single authority of the state. And all the rage in North America is this play about Alexander Hamilton, who was basically the Bukharin of North America, the planner of the bank, the planner of manufacturers. He had more than a 5-year plan. This is Alexander Hamilton. It's true, what I'm saying. Well, here John Donne giving this lecture in Ireland after this tremendous defeat of the Irish rebellion. What does he say in Dublin? And what he says, he brings to the Dubliners the stories that he learned from the Miami people. And these were animal stories. So I thought that it was perhaps a route for me out of my confusions, out of the defeat of the Commons in recent years, out of the appearance of dictatorships in recent years, out of humility before the Marxist revolutionary task, that I could best convey to you by following the methodology of Little Turtle and John Donne. A defeated people, the Miami, talking to another defeated people, the Irish, through animal stories. I'm not saying that you and I are defeated, but certainly we've suffered some blows recently. And so it's animal stories that I want to bring to you today. 2 animal stories of my own. And to be fair, they're not true animal stories. Well, one is the goose. Another is a conch, or strong. And a third is a mole. And these are my, I hope you have moles. Okay. And geese. Do you have conches? Yeah. Oh, of course you do. Like trident, right? Okay. So John Donne compared these stories of the Miami people to the stories told by Homer and Aeschylus and Euripides about the battle at Troy and about the fleet at the Dardanelles. He thought that with the loss of land and the loss of a habitat, and owing to the rise of the drug trade, that is alcoholism, induced by Johnny Appleseed, that the people were going to be extinguished, the Native Americans.
Their stories, he thought, were like the fables that were told among the sailors at Troy. Here he is in Ireland talking about this region of the world. But he's learning about it, similar stories in my region of the world. You see, so here I felt there's a methodology of storytelling through animals, which is like the jet fuel in the bird's eye view, giving me a unity between where I come from and where we are now. That's what came to me. Does that make some sense to you? Okay, because I'm unsure about it. But now here is John Donne speaking to the Irish people. Of whom are we speaking? Who are these evanescent tribes? And in what class of created beings is posterity to them? Ask the Abenaki. He will tell you, describing himself by the name of his nation, that he is a man of the land. So instead of Homo sapien, they had a man of the land. Ask the Illinois. He will tell you boldly he is Inini, a man. Ask the Iroquois. He claims to be Ongi Onwi, the real man. Ask the numerous nation who speak the Algonquin tongue, and their pretensions advance, for they assert they are Nishinanapek, doubly men. Ask their Spanish neighbors, they call them barbarian infidels. Ask the American frontier settler, whom they style Kitchi Mukuman, literally long knife. By him they are denominated savages. Ask the wise men of Europe, who without ever having seen the smoke of an Indian village take the trouble at 3,000 miles distance to dogmatize and write volumes upon their nature, powers, capacities, physical, moral, and intellectuals. These great men will tell you they are an inferior race of men. John Donne continues. To what opinion shall we hold? What constitutes a man? What energies entitle him to rank high in his species? And Donne asked these questions, and he found that the active, heroic, and social virtues of the indigenous people, he from his soul believes the Indian testimony. The man of the land is a real man, not an inferior race of men conceived by the European philosophers. So this is an Irish voice in 1802
combating the introduction of racism and the hierarchy of humankind that had established in the European Enlightenment by Karl Linnaeus and others. He says these tales are worthy of those told at the gates of Troy. They resemble the amusements of Homer. What do you say, Homer? So that I thought that was pretty good. I'm proud to have learned these voices. I'm proud to have heard this speech in 1802 and to bring it alive again. Because as Naomi Klein was teaching at the Edward Said lecture, in my country especially, the specter of racism and of othering, whether by religion, ethnicity, or language, is raised its ugly head. And I think I don't need to emphasize that in Turkey. The challenge for me is to see what is the relationship of that to the automobile civilization, to the structures and to their planet. Naomi Klein says the relationship is intimate, the connection is intimate. 1802, this was the year that the United Kingdom was formed, the UK. It is the year of the extinction of Ireland as an independent political unit. That's what happened in 1801, the United Kingdom. I call my lecture Ned and Kate. Ned is a short nickname for Colonel Edward Marcus Despard, who was Irish, an Anglo-Irishman who was married to an African-American woman named Catherine. Edward Despard lived from 1751 to 1803. In 1803, on February 21st, 1803, he had to mount a gallows in the south of London, and he was hanged. He was sentenced to be hanged, disemboweled, decapitated, and his different body parts spread around. But out of mercy, he was only hanged and decapitated. He hanged with 7 others, former soldiers, 2 of whom were veterans of the Egyptian campaign. You know, when the English were fighting Napoleon in Egypt for control of that part of the Ottoman Empire. So I thought I should mention that. They were navvies, that means they were navigators. They built the canals. They built the roads. They did back work with wheelbarrows and special shovels. Navvies, veterans, weavers. Despard, his goal with these parts of the working class and Irish, their goal was to take the Bank of England, the Tower of London, and the palace, which they wanted to turn into an orphanage. And they had people swear to do this in an oath. And this oath consisted of taking a card and kissing it. Kiss this card for a new constitution promising equalization. That was the term. And it's this term of equalization that he and the others were charged with at their trial. They were charged with leveling and having all things in common. This phrase in English, having all things in common, is like David's rock that is thrown against the Goliath of capital. That's my biblical rhetoric. Okay. And it goes through the ages, that phrase. Then leveling, to have all people on a level of income, power, was a project of equalization and was the main part of the English Revolution 150 years earlier, in the 1640s, at the time of of Milton. And that was the leveler party. So Despard was charged with leveling and commoning. And this is why he suffered. I said there was mercy. Why was there mercy? Now I'm jumping way ahead and I've forgotten my animal stories. And never mind. We'll get, let it come out in the wash. We'll see how it goes. Catherine went to Lord Nelson. You know, the man on the Trafalgar Square on top of that plinth. Lord Nelson and Despard had fought together as British imperialists in Central America, in Nicaragua, what's now Nicaragua, and then in Belize. But in Nicaragua they fought together. Now Nelson is becoming, well, he's the victor of the Nile, isn't he? Of the great battle against Napoleon in Egypt. Nelson is the country's hero, and Despard is the country's villain. But the two of them had gone up a river together, and it was because of Catherine's intervention with Lord Nelson that this mercy to limit the butchery on his body was accomplished. At this point, I would like to think that there are others besides Jesus Christ whose body was looked after by women. Body in death. Despard by Catherine. Richard Parker, who in 1797 had led a mutiny of the entire fleet of Great Britain. He was hanged, and his widow looked after his body to prevent its degradation. Dessalines, you know Dessalines, who led the army of the Incas. The army that fought and defeated the empires of Spain, France, and England in the island of, what shall we call it? Santo Domingo, Saint Domingue, or Haiti. Dessalines was chopped up, and his wife sewed him back together. So here is this moment of reproduction of the corpse of a living soul. Yeah? To me, this is a very moving, very powerful thing that I have learned, and why, and it's a key, I think, to Catherine. The law locks up the man or woman who steals the goose from off the common, but lets the greater villain loose who steals the common from the goose. Have you heard this before? Do you know it by heart? Let me be the professor. And I will repeat it once again. And you will pay attention, because after that, we will all do it. Because this is the most powerful theme, theoretical theme of my talk today. And to understand this quatrain, which has no author, his author is anonymous, is the most popular poem in the English language, historically. The law locks up the man or woman who steals the goose from off the common, but lets the greater villain loose who steals the common from the goose. Shall I bring it? Okay. Shall we try it, or shall I do it again? Please help. Shall we review? The law locks up the man or woman who steals the goose from off the common, but lets the greater villain loose who steals the common from the goose. Now all together. The law locks up the man or woman who steals the goose from off the common, but lets the greater villain loose who steals the common from the goose. You are the most brilliant student. Good, thank you. Thank you. Oh, get top marks. is originally an Irish tale. Before it became in England, it was in Ireland. And it was in Ireland oh, here it is. 1751 to 1803 is our man Despard. His first years, he lives in Ireland. The middle of his life, he lives in the Americas. The end of his life, he lives in England. That's Despard. He left Ireland. His uncle and his aunt's house was burned down by a rising of the peasantry, by a rising of the commoners, called the White Boy Movement. He himself spoke Irish as well as English. He had to. Irish storytellers came. They had no internet, no television, no movies at that time. People had storytellers who would come, and the storytellers spoke Irish, and that was the language.
Despard became a page boy in the Lord Lieutenant. Lord Hereford was the English chief of Ireland. Not chief, but Lord Lieutenant. He was the governor. And Despard was his page boy. That means his gopher. So Despard's eyes are wide open and his ears are open. And he hears how grain is distributed and who gets food and who doesn't get food. Just at the time of the expropriation of Irish lands. At the loss of Irish commons. Despard himself is not a commoner, not by any means. But as a boy, he has this experience. His family has this experience. So when he goes to Jamaica, the sugar island, the slave island, he, as an engineer, in the army, a guy who will sight and position artillery. He's like Napoleon, he's a technical guy. He begins to see how commoning might work among the sappers, among the subalterns, among the slaves in the provision grounds in Jamaica. He arrives right after Tacky's rebellion of 1762, when slaves from West Africa believed, Ashanti warriors believed, that bullets could not penetrate or kill them. And they rose up. In response, the English authorities in Jamaica hanged 400. Despard arrives just 2 years afterwards, after such a trauma. He sees survival, as I said, in provision grounds. That's Jamaica. He goes to Nicaragua. The goal there of the British Empire is to divide North and South America, is to destroy the Spanish Empire by going up the San Juan River to Lake Nicaragua, uniting the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. This is a project which is alive again thanks to Chinese capital. On this, he's dependent on the Mosquito Commons. The Mosquito are an indigenous people that is still powerful in Nicaragua, who are coastal people. Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz lived amongst them. The Mosquito know how to live in this ecology with plantains, with other vegetables which can grow quickly. Also, he allies with fisher folk, people who turtle and collect lobsters, some of whose cooperative commoning still exists in Belize, if not on the coast, on the Mosquito shore. In Belize itself, We did the goose, didn't we? Did we do the goose? Okay. Like, how much time is going by? Can we have a little break here so I can just check in? How much?
Yeah. Sure. It's been 50 minutes.
50?
50.
Okay.
Felt like 15.
What?
It felt like 15.
Did it? Thank you. Thanks. So I'll try to make the next 15 not seem like 50. But,
Do you want to take a break?
Yeah.
okay, we can take a break, but not quite yet. I'm just beginning. Just beginning. But never mind. I'm not here for the dead. I'm here for us. So, by that break, we took care of the goose.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Because I'm coming now. This is the other reason I'm confused. Is this love story between Ned and Kate? It's not like a romance for Hollywood. I have to think of a new kind of love that includes, as we were saying with my Turkish publishing collective, we were saying a love that includes conflict, a love that includes, a new word. I need to find a new word to describe the relationship of Ned and Kate. But they had a child, for sure. There's that aspect. But there's something very deep in the structural changes of production and reproduction that take place during their lifetime and that still affect us. Yeah, for instance, there's many of them. Let me just quickly give two. Will you pay attention to what I've been saying so that when I get lost you can return me to this point? I'll give you two. The man who sentenced Despard to die, one week later, introduced a bill in the House of Lords making abortion a capital crime for the first time in English history. So the state wants to control the woman's body for the purposes of reproducing labor power. And it will make any form of abortion, or of course infanticide, punishable by death. So that's example number one. Example number two, I will get to in a circuitous way. Part of the wisdom that we historians need to understand the past is not just the ruling class wisdom, which we should mention before it's over, but the subaltern wisdom, the wisdom that Gramsci says is expressed in Proverbs by people who do not have time to study books, but must express the wisdom in a succinct way. And here's the Irish wisdom that ends the stories that an Irish storyteller tells. Beware, my children, of three things in life: the hoof of a horse, the horn of a bull, and the smile of an Englishman. Now, what wisdom is in here? The hoof is traction for transport. The horn is fertility for ranching and the destruction of the commons, of subsistence farming, in exchange for production for McDonald's, so to speak, for roast beef and all that. The transport system is going to change in 1802 on railroads and on steamships, both propelled by the steam engine. Both the steam engine, for all forms of transport, depend upon coal. Coal that is found underground, and coal whose noxious gases now are in the atmosphere, as at this era the world was turned upside down. The lithosphere became the stratosphere, and we suffer. Or our Syrian brothers and sisters, and the refugees from Afghanistan, the Mideast, Iran, Iraq, North Africa. We must lay directly on this structural feature of the UK and then the USA for this civilization. This is, I think there's no way around this. Okay, where was I? The smile of an Englishman. The smile of an Englishman. The Englishman who wants the abolition of slavery. Oh, lovely. Why? Because the alternative is Tacky's rebellion. But now, hanging 400 is not enough to suppress the sugar proletariat in Jamaica, or the richest colony in the world, which was Haiti, because the Haitian people, the Haitian former slaves, are winning in just 10 years to abolish slavery for the first successful slave revolt in world history, to my knowledge. Now, perhaps in Asia Minor, you can teach me about successful slave revolts in this region. The English in 1802 did not want to see slave rebellions in Dominica, in Jamaica, in the British West Indies, or in the West Indies that they coveted for the sugar plantation. They didn't want to see that. Instead, they began not to have the transatlantic slave trade, though in 1802 there were more slave ships sent to New Orleans and to Maryland than ever before in world history. Just like in 1802, there were more enclosure acts enclosing the land in England than ever before in English history. This was the maximum repression of land and people that organized by the Atlantic system. Organized by what Winston Churchill called the special relationship. Have you heard that geopolitical expression? The special relationship between the USA and the UK. Got that? That's those of you. I'm getting this. You're hearing what I want to convey. So that smile of an Englishman, now the Englishman and the Englishman in North America developed the internal slave trade, which is to promote the breeding by African American women to produce new slaves in North America. This process begins in 1802. It's called the internal slave trade. Its center is in Baltimore and New Orleans. This is significant for us because in 1802, 60% of English cotton imports came from the American South. In 1790, just 12 years earlier, no cotton came from the American South. In the 1790s, cotton becomes king. This is what the U.S. Constitution is all about. It's all about establishing slavery in the American South. Not only slavery, but cotton. This is synthetic. This is oil. This is some cotton. This is some cotton. Examine. I don't need to tell you because cotton comes from here. Cotton is an autonym. 20% of the cotton for the English factories came from Thessaloniki in 1790. None came from the South. But in 1802, 20% came from the American South and 0 from Thessaloniki or from Anatolia. That is the big geopolitical change. Now, how are these changes organized? They are organized through the banks, through banking. Who is going to get capital? What amounts of loans are going to go out? We know this in our own world, but to describe and to discover how that banks and finance capital was able to organize these geopolitical changes, historians have failed in their task to explain. But the Irish wisdom, why does the banker smile? Why does the English banker smile? Causes us to remember this fact. And I'm glad to bring it here because it has, again, to do, I was just learning about the history of this region and its relationship to cotton. Right? Is that good? Okay. I was trying to make my whole thing like relevant. But I have to breathe heavily because we're talking about heavy things. And I need to calm down and to be with friends. And it's the animals that help me do it. And when my daughter Riley and I, we went to school in Chiapas. We, nine of us went to school, to the Escuelita. Did any of you go to the Escuelita in Chiapas? It was 2013, 2014. In the highlands of Mayan civilization, where the brown people were recovering the land that had been their own for generations, and where commoning had taken place with the milpa, the three sisters of what? Of beans, corn, squash, joined together. And milpa. And so I went to this ejido to be a student and live with a family for 10 days. But we were welcomed by the villagers, the commoners who lived there. There was no automobiles or anything, and we went to a church. And it was right at Christmas time when the Christians celebrate the birth of their Savior with a tree and their little baby in a creche with animals around. And right there among the pine needles on the floor, there was a conch. There was a horn. This was the sound of liberation. This was the call for the slaves to assemble, to begin to burn the plantation in Jamaica, in Haiti, in the American South. This was the call that struck deep, bone-chilling fear in the Thomas Jeffersons, the James Madisons, the George Washingtons of the Anglo-American special relationship. That's the conch. But the conch is a long way from Belize. But I saw it there in the highlands, so it must have come through the selva, through the woods. And of course, trade between the Caribbean Sea and the highlands of the Lacandon jungle is very old. This to me was a clue that Despard, when he became superintendent of Belize in 1787, became familiar with the Mayan commons, with the milpa, with the production of plantains, for reproduction of himself and his troops. But now, as superintendent of British Honduras or Belize, he has grown some. I think he has met Catherine by this time. I know he's met Catherine by this time. He has a town. They make a town and they distribute land. They distribute land by lottery. Everybody, Mayan, Mosquito, Irish, English soldier, sailor, who is an inhabitant of this town, will have some land. They do it by lottery, without regard to color, religion, or race. This is in 1787. Meanwhile, north in Philadelphia, the American Constitution Assembly is putting together the USA. And they want to do so in order to prevent theoretic politicians, I'm quoting James Madison in the Federalist Papers number 10, from having any sway with the multitude. Theoretic politicians are those who aren't just subsistence commoners, but they're ideal commoners. They want equalization for all. So it's not just a perpetuation of older forms of production and reproduction, but people like Thomas Spence, like Gracchus Babeuf, like William Godwin, these have access to all things in common, which earlier I referred to as Christian, but it actually is much older than that. It's also Hebraic, it's also Arabic. This notion of periodic redistribution, and the redistribution by the means of a lottery. The lottery is the only part. It's not representation, it's luck. Who's going to get what land? And then this is the principle that Despard used. And it's for this that the big planters of Belize, who were dealing with mahogany and dye stuffs or logwood, caused him to fall into debt and caused him to be removed to England in 1790 in debt. But before we pick up the story in England, which we'll do quickly and is a very good story and can be even a conclusion, and James Madison is the most brilliant erudite student of constitutions and everything. And he says the ruling class must unite. The ruling class consists of landlords, merchants, manufacturers, and bankers. Finance capital, merchant capital, agrarian capital, and another capital that I forget. But you have it in your notes. Right? He's saying, we must unite and make a constitution so that unity can happen. That meant the slaveholders and the merchants and the bankers had to cooperate. But they were antagonistic, and antagonism, which will come up again in the Civil War much later. But in 1787, while Despard is following a very different path in Belize, in Philadelphia, James Madison is producing this historical materialist analysis of constitutions. The second person was named James Wilson. George Washington appoints him to the first Supreme Court of the USA. His first lectures are against the commons. It's a praise of private property. It's a fact. You can read it online. They don't teach it to you in school in the USA. But the founding of the USA is based on this notion of private property. If any of you have had the misfortune to fly across the United States with that bird's eye view that I began our lecture with, what you will see is why the United States is full of squares. It is because in 1796, that imagination of Thomas Jefferson in particular surveyed the land and made the land into squares. Whereas the other day, I'm flying to Istanbul, I'm flying over Serbia and Bulgaria and I don't know where. You look down there and there are no squares. You know, everything's a jumble. And this is because the straight line is the road to perdition. Wisdom is always on a crooked line. That's why I love these streets in Istanbul. So that survey, that is public. That land is stolen. You see, it becomes public property. This is why the public and the commons are separate, are antagonistic in the USA. Thank you.
Excuse me.
Of course. Thank you for your patience while it lasted. They have other things to do. They told me ahead of time. And also it reminds me to... Well, we did the caracol, didn't we? Okay.
Conch.
The conch. Oh, the conch.
Conch we did. Conch.
Okay, 1922, in the Journal of Experimental Zoology,
I read an article by J.H. Parker on the Strombolus, which is the Latin Strombolus giga, which is the Latin name for the conch. How does the conch move, you're wondering? You know, at the bottom of the sea, because it has no legs and it has no wings. How does it move? It has, it pole vaults. It carries its own vault. It comes out of itself like this, and then somehow, I've never seen this, I've only read it in that journal article I cited, it's able to put that down and then toss itself over its own pole vault. You follow me? And it leaves no trace for a predator to follow. Now, between you and me, this reminds me of Lenin. Because Lenin said, and C.L.R. James repeats this, leap, leap, leap to follow. This is another side to the conch that I had no idea of. That it can leap over whole epochs, whole stages of history. Isn't it amazing what human beings can do if we just live like the conch? You know, we can jump over. You've heard of stadialism? Of course. Oh, commons. That's the primitive communism. Yeah, we know primitive communism. And then came slave society, then came feudalism, then came commercial life, and then came capitalism. Those are the stages of history that the ruling class taught them. So it's all right to have primitive communism as long as it's long ago. And it's all right to have a little bit of feudalism as long as it's just cute and antique. But we live in progress, in capitalism. These are the stages of history, my dear. That's what we were taught. And we were taught it through economics. And some of our communist friends fell for this and said also, oh, it's the same for communism. First we have primitive communism, then we have slave society, then we have feudalism, then we have commerce, then we have capitalism, and then we'll have socialism, and after that we might have communism again. But meanwhile, wait. I mean, I don't think it, I think that's accurate. I know it's accurate. And it comes from the Scottish rulers who dispossessed the Highlands of Scotland. That's where that idea comes from. It doesn't come from Vico. It comes from William Robertson, Adam Smith, Adam Ferguson. It originates in the lowlands of Scotland with the experience of having dispossessed, stolen the commons of the Highlanders. That was their excuse. They were saying, oh, they're backward. We have sympathy for them, but they're historically obsolete. Therefore, they must die. It's the same with Thomas Jefferson in 1802. He's saying of the Miami people, whose stories I began today's lecture with, he's saying their history must terminate. Those are Thomas Jefferson's words. Their history must terminate. This is genocide, or that's a later word. This is mass destruction of human beings. What is a human being? The indigenous people asked. And we ask today. Okay. Can you hang in for a little bit longer? Or shall we wrap it up? We'll do the mold quickly. All right, you know the mold, right? Oh, you know it from Marx. Oh. I can hear from you. But he got it from Hegel. Did you know that? And Hegel got it from Shakespeare. Because Shakespeare got it from Hamlet. And Hamlet is having a problem. That he must restore legitimacy. He must kill the king. But he doesn't want to. He has a problem doing it. But he gets his friends to swear an oath. And at that moment that he's swearing, the ghost of his real father emerges. And Hamlet says, well burrowed old mole. And Hegel got it from there, and then Marx got it. And then you're wondering, where did I get it? I got it last summer in South Africa because I was in Grahamstown, and every day I would go by this rich school, and on the other side of the fence into their playing field, their soccer grounds, the moles would have their hills, their little mountains. And I saw it and I asked, what are these? And they said, they're moles. And they would hire people to crush the mountains so that the rich children could play. But then it would rain, and the next day, on both sides of the fence, the molehills would resume. So I thought, these moles, they know something. Maybe it's not like leaping, but still they know something, they're persistent. And Hamlet called them pioneers. Now the pioneer is someone who's a miner. They dig underground. Oh, I was suddenly thinking of the 300 coal miners who died.
Soul.
Yeah. So solidarity to those families, to those of you who have friends amongst them. History is full of grief. It's full of grief. In 2014, the miners of Marikana were shot by the state in South Africa and by the ANC and by their trade union. The trade union, the police, and the government shot these miners. And the miners were digging underground. They were producing platinum. Now I am so alienated from the world. I didn't even know what platinum was for. You know, I thought, oh, it must be for a wedding ring or something. No. Platinum is essential to the catalytic converter that reduces the noxious gases that come out of the automobile. I didn't know this. So these miners are at the forefront, in a way, of preventing the gases that are causing the aridity line. Our solidarity with those miners is a prerequisite, is an absolute necessity. Not in some nameless humanitarian solidarity, but for the self-interest of the planet. The ANC and the state said, no, they are backward. They are practicing their ancient stories, telling their ancient stories with their ancient weapons, sticks, with their ancient dances on an ancient hill, which is their commons. So here, what seemed to be most backward was at the forefront of a green economy. I'm not saying it's a solution, a panacea. I'm just saying for myself, I need to know how the world works. You follow me? So that to me is enough. It's to add on to the mole. You know, as the miner who works underground. And this year, 1802, was a year of the underground, which is another lecture. But that's the E.P. Thompson lecture, when the working class went underground. And he says Despard led that underground movement. He does not mention Catherine. Catherine, who the years before had been agitating in the newspapers, in Parliament, in the streets, with the other wives of political prisoners, with the wives of the mutineers of the Navy, with the wives of the Democrats and the Painites, like Mrs. Richard Evans. And they formed a committee, and they meet outside of prisons. And they would try to bring in food. And the way they hid that food and carried that food into prison, we can find out how they did it. And they also took in literature. And Catherine went in with, you've seen some of those billowing skirts of the 18th century women. And in those skirts was papers, was writings and pamphlets, which were taken into the prison. Catherine is on the advance of the struggle against the prison of Foucault's prison. At the moment when Kilmainham Jail, Coldbath Fields, Newgate, the big panopticons are being formed in England and in the USA. This is why, to me, Ned and Kate, is a love story that we must honor to this day. The women and the men. Okay, I'm just going to get rhetorical. And you don't need that. So we did them all? Enough? Basta, do you think?
You didn't really finish about the love affair, and we need another word for their love. Could we finish with on a tone?
On what?
On a tone of love?
On the tone of love. I love you. I love you.
Since there was no word to actually describe the relationship.
Oh yeah, because I thought, well, I'll try agape. Because that was Martin Luther King. He went for agape. But I got to change the meaning there a little bit. I've got to explore that theologically, spiritually, blah, blah. But for the moment, that's what I'm thinking of. And in contrast to eros, well, not in complete contrast, in connection with eros. But it's, and differentiated from philia, or philia, of love of comrades. So it has to do, in my mind, with love of justice and of liberation, and I want to tie it to the commons. For years, people would say to me, oh, you're a romantic. And this bothered me, because I knew they meant it as an insult. And so I would answer them and I'd say, I love kissing. As if romance was osculation. But 1802 was the time of Wordsworth, the time of Blake, the time not of Shelley, but of Coleridge. Coleridge and Wordsworth, they called for history from below, but then they got scared and they backed off. In the first version of lyrical ballads, they had poems to prisoners. By 1802, that version, they take out those poems. But William Blake does not. William Blake understands that, oh, I forgot the whole mode of production thing. And that's the basis, man. Hey, Marxist friends, how could I have done that? I'm sorry. My comrades, where are my Stalinist friends who said, Peter, remember the mode of production. Okay, that mode of production was the plantation and slavery. The mode of production was the factory and the children. 1802 for both of them. 1802. And mechanization. The Eli Whitney's cotton gin, the power loom, the steam engine. All of these machines are brought in this decade. This is counter-revolution against the commons. This is not industrial revolution, progress, improvement, or development. It's none of those things. This is death, and it's intended to be death. And pleasure and for the few. That's what history shows. At the birth of the USA and the UK, and they must go. But, okay, love, solidarity. I was trying to evoke it. Were you here at the beginning? Yeah, you heard about the animal stories. Yeah, so the people are talking to each other. And William Blake, he understands that the machines, the wheels inside wheels, are all over the world. They're in the Euphrates, as well as the Nile, as well as the Thames, as well as the Hudson. So this imagination of the great prophet of that time, who was William Blake, is global. Someone asked me to emphasize the global nature of commoning. And this is how it took place, on shipboard, where, our colleague Marcus Rediker has pioneered in his great book called The Slave Ship, where he shows that it's the African-American slave who in the end helps the Anglo sailor who has been cast aside. It's a powerful, powerful book. You should get him to come here and speak. He's a good speaker.
gathering.
I'm still curious about Kate.
Yeah.
Yeah, me too, but.
Yeah.
How do they meet?
What am I gonna do?
Yeah, I mean, like class, or I mean, I am just curious about where did she came from. How did they? What did she do?
What she did, she
Before-
washed his clothes,
Huh?
I'm guessing. She washed his clothes, she prepared his food, she looked after him. This is the role that the woman slave would perform for the Anglo man who came to the plantations. And she provided sexual services, and she remained. So when he returned to the islands on the northwest of Europe, she remained. That was the story. And the great tradition of Jamaican nursing comes out of this experience, right through the 19th and into the 20th century. To this day in London, so many nurses in the past have been from the islands, or their grandparents. That's one possibility. Another possibility is that during the American War of Independence, she was at the evacuation of Charlestown. Remember, the British, as a war policy, freed the slaves. They said, if you will join the British, we will grant you manumission. You're no longer a slave. So she may have left there. The third possibility is in Belize. We know they were together in Belize, in British Honduras. And if that's the case, there's only one or two other, there's nobody else that I know of who returned to the British Isles with an African-American consort or wife or partner at that time. Despard was unique in this way. So that's something special. She wrote no letters. She wrote letters to the newspaper against the tyrant of one of the prisons. In Parliament, the friends of the governor of the prison tried to say somebody else wrote those letters. But this was a common racist maneuver. So she was literate, she became literate. She was protected after he was killed. She found safety back in Ireland. And I forget when it was, we went to Ireland, we walked along the canal path, I went to the house where the people were looking after her, and I went to their grave house, or their tomb, which was locked and rusty and filled with dust, and with lots of coffins or sarcophagi in them, to see if I could find her. But she wasn't there. So I still haven't found her remains. I haven't found his either. But this is a project that I think our comrades in Ireland or elsewhere must do, to recover her memory for the same reason that she helped to preserve his memory. And the other, because the preservation of the body is the first step in history, the first step of remembrance. That's why the ruling class wants to destroy the body, in their massacres. Because the body is living testimony that the person existed. And then stories can build from there. And that is an aspect of life. But yeah, I am very curious about her. And it's just so hard to get. The woman's story in this period is beginning to emerge in a new way. Carolyn Steedman is a great historian in England who knows more about this subject than anyone else. That is the servants in England. Because it's not just the Anglo ruling class abroad, the Anglo ruling class at home. Their body is maintained by many women, you know, who clean them, who wash them, who feed them, who look after them when they're sick. You know, the day is endless. And it's why Mary Wollstonecraft in 1791, she says, my goal is to create a new genre of a human being, a new kind of woman. You know how at the beginning I said, what is a man? What the Indians were saying. Mary Wollstonecraft said, what is a woman? This was a period when work was industrial work, that the notion that life could be granted only if you sold your life to the factory or to the pushing system. That was the great technology of the growth of productivity. 40 pounds of cotton a single slave could produce in a day. By 1860, it's 400 pounds. What had caused this tenfold increase in productivity? A new tool. What was that tool? It was introduced in 1802 on a large scale. It was the whip. That is the machine of a so-called industrial revolution. There's a wonderful book called The Story is Half Told. It is by a man named Baptist. And it tells this story. It's called The Pushing System. And it really opens up the eyes. You know, this is the time, 1802, that Engels separated scientific socialism from utopian socialism. He said that separation occurred in 1802. Scientific socialism depends on access to the proletariat. Utopian socialism is just the socialism of idealists from the Enlightenment, basically. And he says this division happens in 1802. But Engels did not include women in his understanding of the proletariat, at least in this discussion. He did not include indigenous people in his, he did not include slaves. I don't say this to badmouth Engels, I'm just saying to show the limitations of knowledge at that time. We can criticize Engels because we stand on his shoulders, and the proletariat and the people of the world were far, far greater, and their knowledge was more interesting, as I hope I've been able to show you. And that the struggle for the commons requires us to leap and requires us to burrow underground, and it will come again. Comrades, we can gain strength from history. History is behind us. It is with us.
Thank you so much.